They waved to crowds. They lit up newspapers. They graced coins, portraits, and childhood daydreams. But behind the palace gates they were loathed, by their families, their advisors, even their servants. This is not the royalty you were taught to admire. These are the royals the public loved, and the inner circle hated. Petty tyrants, charming disasters, velvet-wrapped headaches and crowns. Because in the House of Windsor, and everything that came before it, public adoration means nothing if you make life unbearable for the people who have to live with you. Let's begin. Before we dive in, if you love peeling back the royal wallpaper to find the cracks underneath, hit that subscribe button and join us for more deep dives into the stories history tried to tidy up. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? We want to know who's out there unraveling the monarchy with us, whether it's 3 p.m. in London or 2 a.m. in a basement in Ohio. All right, time to open the gates. 1. Princess Diana. She smiled like a secret, and that was the problem. By the time the tabloids crowned her the people's princess, the real royal family was already trying to figure out how to quietly disappear her, emotionally if not physically. Diana wasn't just an icon, she was a problem, the kind that didn't wear out, give in, or keep her mouth shut when it counted most. Her fairy tale image with Prince Charles was carefully arranged for public digestion, but inside the gilded cage, she was treated like a guest overstaying her welcome at a party thrown in her honor. The public never saw the meetings behind palace doors, the ones filled with exasperated sighs, veiled insults, and quiet admissions that she was, quite simply, too much, too emotional, too unpredictable, too willing to take her pain and make it public currency. The institution wanted a quiet, supportive wife for the future king. What they got was a global force who understood media optics better than anyone else in the family, including the Queen. Diana understood something the firm didn't. You could lose a war of power and still win the war of narrative. And she did, repeatedly. Every televised interview, every charitable hospital visit, every carefully timed photo op, she turned empathy into armor. The monarchy had the bloodline, but Diana had the story, which meant she had the people. And in a family that thrives on perception more than affection, that made her a threat. Behind closed doors, she was rarely seen as the angelic figure the press adored. Staff described her as high-maintenance, manipulative, and occasionally self-destructive. Courtiers whispered about the chaos she left in her wake, the phone calls, the moods, the games. To them, she wasn't the wronged woman. She was a master chess player who didn't follow the rules because she'd long stopped believing they protected her. Charles, meanwhile, saw her as an emotional hurricane. From the beginning, he'd wanted someone to fit a role, not someone who might rewrite the whole play. Their marriage, despite the camera-ready smiles, rotted from within. And once Diana started openly discussing their issues, on tape, on air, on record, it wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a betrayal of the code. The unspoken rule that family humiliations are to be buried under titles, not broadcast in prime time. But it wasn't just Charles. Other royals found her exhausting. Her celebrity outshone them at every turn. State visits, diplomatic functions, casual walks into hospitals. Diana drew the cameras, the cheers, and the emotion. The monarchy, built on mystique and restraint, now had to compete with someone fluent in tears, touch, and tabloid poetry. They called her attention-seeking, but what they really meant was uncontainable. There were efforts, subtle and sustained, to bring her in line, to manage her image, to keep her on the script. But Diana, famously, never really played the part they cast for her. Even when stripped of her royal status, she made sure her presence stayed louder than her absence. Her post-divorce humanitarian work wasn't just personal redemption, it was public defiance. Walking through landmines in Angola with a calm smile wasn't just bravery, it was branding. A royal gone rogue and more beloved for it. Inside the palace, her name was spoken less with reverence and more with fatigue, like someone recalling a storm they didn't survive. And yet outside, she was mythology in real time, candlelit vigils, weeping crowds, a nation in mourning for a woman the monarchy never quite knew what to do with. Her death, tragic and unresolved, gave the public something the royals couldn't: catharsis. And perhaps that's the final insult. The one they never say out loud. Because Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a rebuke. A soft-faced rebellion with mascara and migraines. She weaponized vulnerability. She made the monarchy look archaic. And worst of all, she did it with style. Which brings us to another royal who seemed universally beloved on the balcony, but, behind the scenes, was often treated like a velvet-wrapped liability by her own flesh and blood. Not a rebel like Diana, no, but someone who learned how to pull the strings from behind the curtain, and smiled all the while. Her Majesty, the Queen Mother. 2. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. She lived to be over 100, and every second of it was curated. To the public, she was the ever-smiling matriarch in pastel coats and pearls, a living relic from a bygone era, the human embodiment of British resilience. She waved from balconies like she invented the gesture. She drank gin before lunch and outlived 3/4 of her enemies. To the average citizen, she was delightful, charming, stalwart, a woman of service and sacrifice. The royal grandmother everyone wished they had. But behind the soft-focused nostalgia was a personality carved from flint. And inside the palace, many who worked with her, staff, relatives, even other royals, privately found her less beloved grandmother and more political operator in a brooch. The Queen Mother had a gift for seeming harmless while quietly maneuvering chess pieces behind the scenes. She had learned early that power in the royal household didn't have to look like power. It just had to outlast everyone else. And she did. She outlasted generations of courtiers and even her own rivals within the family. Her smile never cracked, even as she pulled strings so deftly that most people never noticed who was holding the marionette. She didn't need to shout to get her way. She had a way of making people feel that disagreeing with her was like slapping a corgi, pointless, mean-spirited, and destined to end in your exile. Her influence was subtle but persistent. It crept through the corridors of the palace like a well-trained footman, never seen, always felt. Some members of the royal family found her suffocating. She had strong opinions about whom people should marry, what traditions should be kept, and how to maintain the monarchy's image. Opinions she was not shy about enforcing. She famously opposed Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, long before Diana entered the scene. She disapproved of modern touches and modern people. To her, duty meant control, and control was everything. Even Queen Elizabeth II, her own daughter, reportedly found her difficult at times. Though they remained close, the Queen was said to be frustrated by her mother's political meddling and resistance to change. The Queen Mother operated with a set of values that seemed frozen in the 1930s, and she expected others to follow suit, regardless of the decade. Staff described her as charming, yes, but also impossible to please. One famously noted that she expected a bottle of Dubonnet and gin by 11 a.m., a perfectly chilled wine with lunch, and total loyalty at all times. She could be imperious and deeply opinionated, with a sharp tongue wrapped in velvet. Disagreement was not welcome. Dissent was dismissed. And yet, to the public, she remained the enduring symbol of wartime bravery and royal grace. Her refusal to leave London during the Blitz, her long widowhood after King George VI's death, and her constant presence beside her daughter during national crises, all of it painted a portrait of unshakable dignity. The truth was murkier. She wasn't just a passive survivor of the 20th century. She was a shaper of it, in ways both admirable and unnerving. She could hold a grudge like it was fine china. She used tradition as both shield and sword. And she never forgot a slight, especially if it came from someone she considered below her station, which was almost everyone. Her talent was making the monarchy look warm while keeping it cold. She smiled, and behind that smile were calculations, biases, and the quiet belief that the world should stay exactly as it was when she was 20. And perhaps it's that frozen worldview, so beautiful on the outside, so ruthless within, that made her both adored and quietly resented. Which brings us to a royal who never learned how to freeze. A king so popular in his youth, he practically walked on water, until the tide turned, and his courtiers found themselves drowning in fear. A king of wives, war, and worsening moods, the Tudor everyone remembers. Henry VIII, early reign, before the executions. If you're still here after two royals and a growing pile of velvet resentment, you're clearly one of us. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel for more stories that peel back the polish and dive into the dysfunction. And while you're listening, drop a comment. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Melbourne? Sunrise in Saskatchewan? We want to know who's watching history unravel in real time. Now let's get back to it, because the royal drama is just getting warmed up. 3. Henry VIII, early reign. Long before he became the bloated caricature of tyranny in oil paintings, Henry VIII was a golden boy, quite literally. Athletic, handsome, fluent in multiple languages, generous to a fault, and, most importantly, utterly adored by the English public. He threw jousts, he played music, he wrote poetry, he hosted court masques where he played the leading role. He was, for a time, the very image of Renaissance monarchy, virile, vital, and apparently sent from God to bless England with charm and virility. And yet, if you had asked anyone in his inner circle, his ministers, his noblemen, even his wives' families, they might have smiled politely while silently praying for a short meeting and an early exit. Because while the public was busy applauding, the people who actually had to work with Henry knew the truth. Behind the charisma was a man who could pivot from affection to fury before the ink dried on your last compliment. In the early years of his reign, Henry was surrounded by sycophants and survivors, because those were the only kinds of people who lasted. He was famously impatient with bureaucracy, suspicious of advice, and prone to changing course with the emotional stability of a dice roll. Ministers served at the pleasure of his moods, and while the country saw a bright young king with modern ideas and a dazzling court, insiders saw an unpredictable ruler whose greatest hobby was disappointment. His advisors, Wolsey, More, Cromwell, would learn in due time that favor was a currency with no fixed rate. One day you were indispensable, the next you were a liability. Even in his early years, before the paranoia set in, and before history would paint him as a tyrant, Henry had a knack for making people feel like they were walking on a floor that could collapse at any moment. He wanted loyalty, but not too much independence. Intelligence, but not too much disagreement. Wit, but never at his expense. Courtiers learned quickly to laugh when he laughed, agree when he nodded, and pray that someone else would say the wrong thing first. His marriages, even in the beginning, sent ripples through the court. Catherine of Aragon may have been well-liked and respected, but the moment she failed to produce the desired male heir, the whispers began. Not from the public, they still adored their queen, but from the people behind the throne, who sensed the king's growing impatience. The quiet resentment came not just from his harsh decisions, but from the fact that no one ever knew which version of Henry they'd get in the morning. The philosopher king or the sulking adolescent with a crown. Even his closest allies found themselves exhausted. One moment he was generous, showering his friends with titles and estates. The next, he was demanding loyalty tests disguised as casual conversation. His court was not a workplace, it was a stage, and everyone was always performing, even when the curtain was down. Yet the people loved him. They loved the tournaments. They loved the foreign wars at first. They loved the pageantry, the glamour, the illusion of strength. To them, Henry was a king who made England feel important. But to those standing closest to the throne, he was something else entirely, a storm in waiting. Because even at his most charming, most golden, most beloved, Henry VIII had one habit that never changed. He burned through people, and he didn't even pretend to be sorry afterward. Which brings us to someone who knew all about being burned, by politics, by scandal, by her own court. A royal with one of the most romanticized legacies in British history, but whose actual life was marked by betrayal, suspicion, and a court that never quite decided if she was queen or liability. Mary, Queen of Scots. 4. Mary, Queen of Scots. She was born into a crown but never into safety. Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of the most romanticized figures in British history, a queen in exile, a tragic beauty, a doomed monarch whose life reads like an Elizabethan soap opera. In portraits, she's draped in velvet and mystery. In historical novels, she's a victim of fate and jealous cousins. And to the public, especially in centuries after her death, she became a Catholic martyr, a tragic heroine, a woman wronged by men and monarchs alike. But inside her own court, Mary wasn't always seen as a figure to be pitied. She was, at various times, mistrusted, resented, and outright despised by the very nobles she was supposed to command. Her downfall wasn't just the result of bad luck. It was assisted, enthusiastically, by the people closest to her. She became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. Too young to rule, too valuable to ignore. Sent to France at 5 to be raised in splendor, she grew up more Parisian than Presbyterian, a polished royal educated in courts far more sophisticated than the one she'd eventually be expected to rule. When she returned to Scotland as a teenager, widowed and French in manner, she stepped into a country that was colder, both in climate and in welcome. The Scottish nobles who were supposed to serve her didn't see her as one of their own. She spoke with a French accent. She trusted foreign advisors. She dressed like a Catholic queen in a Protestant nation. And worst of all, she underestimated just how cutthroat her native court had become while she was away. Mary ruled with more charm than strategy, and while the people may have admired her beauty and grace, her counsel often found her political instincts lacking. She relied too heavily on advisors from abroad. She misread alliances. She married badly, disastrously even. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a handsome disaster with a sense of entitlement that far outpaced his usefulness. He alienated the nobles, insulted her court, and eventually became so problematic that a group of Mary's own insiders conspired to get rid of him, permanently. It didn't help that her third marriage, to the Earl of Bothwell, rumored to have orchestrated Darnley's death, felt less like a royal match and more like a power grab. Some even whispered it was abduction. Whatever it was, it solidified the perception among her nobles that Mary wasn't just politically naive. She was dangerously unfit to rule. They didn't just criticize her. They turned on her, armed, in broad daylight. She was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, a queen no more, and still in her 20s. And yet, in England, where she fled for protection, her legend only grew. To English Catholics, she was the rightful queen. To poets, a romantic heroine. To Elizabeth I, she was a threat so dangerous that she had to be kept under watch for nearly 2 decades. And when she was finally executed, it was not by Scotland, nor by her enemies in court, but by a cousin who feared her legacy more than her presence. Mary was not just a tragic figure. She was a mirror, reflecting the fears, ambitions, and betrayals of everyone around her. She was loved publicly because she suffered visibly, but privately, many were glad to see her fall, because for them, she was never truly a queen, just a problem in a crown. And yet, even her fiercest critics had to admit, she knew how to hold a room. She could make loyalty feel like romance, and rebellion feel like survival. A quality not unfamiliar to another queen, one who ruled longer than almost anyone else, and yet was often met with cold shoulders inside her own palace. Queen Victoria in her younger years. Before the statues. Before the sainthood. When she was still just a girl in power, both adored and deeply, deeply resented. 5. Queen Victoria, younger years. Before she became the widow in black, before her silhouette was stamped on everything from coins to colonies, Queen Victoria was a teenage girl with absolute power, and a growing list of people who quietly wished she'd never been born. To the public, young Victoria was a revelation. England had just staggered through the chaotic reigns of uncles and cousins, and here came this petite, earnest 18-year-old queen, unburdened by scandal and gifted with a sharp sense of purpose. She was seen as a fresh start, a symbol of stability, a constitutional monarch who read her briefing papers, answered her red boxes, and didn't start wars because someone had insulted her hat. But inside Buckingham Palace, the story was more complicated. Her early reign was marked not by cooperation, but by a quiet war with the very people meant to guide her: her mother, her courtiers, her advisors, even her husband eventually. Behind the scenes, Victoria was emotionally intense, deeply attached to a select few, and fiercely loyal, sometimes to the wrong people. As a young queen, she leaned heavily on her advisor and rumored surrogate father figure, Lord Melbourne. Their relationship made for dramatic headlines and private discomfort. Many at court resented his outsized influence over the queen. They saw a girl being shaped by a man who knew exactly how to keep power by whispering in her ear. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, didn't help. The two had a famously frigid relationship, one that verged on open hostility. The Duchess had attempted to control Victoria's upbringing through the restrictive Kensington system, a suffocating regimen designed to keep the future queen isolated, obedient, and emotionally dependent. It backfired. Victoria grew up distrustful, rebellious, and unusually independent for someone raised like a porcelain doll in a glass case. When she ascended the throne, she promptly banished her mother's closest advisor, Sir John Conroy, from court, an act that earned applause from the public and grudging respect from politicians, but also set the tone for her reign: intensely personal, often combative, and deeply suspicious of anyone she hadn't chosen herself. Even after her marriage to Prince Albert, a match that mellowed her public image, tensions inside the palace didn't exactly vanish. Albert was intelligent, principled, and reform-minded. He was also resented by many courtiers who felt he exerted too much influence over the queen, particularly in matters of governance. Victoria adored him. Some days, to the exclusion of everything else. The more she leaned into Albert, the more isolated she became from the very people expected to support her. Victoria's children didn't always look back on her early years with warmth either. Her parenting style, intensely controlling, often emotionally distant, was criticized even in private letters. She wanted order, discipline, and loyalty. What she often got in return was silence, distance, or quiet rebellion. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, would later write of her mother with a kind of affectionate detachment, admiring her strength but wary of her emotional grip. Despite this, the public saw none of it. They saw a queen growing into her crown, a young woman balancing love, motherhood, and statecraft. Her early reign was marked by cultural renewal, expanding empire, and relative peace. People saw the portraits, the soft gaze, the modest dress, and believed in a monarch who represented family values and moral leadership. But inside the palaces, some quietly rolled their eyes. They saw the emotional drama, the favoritism, the pettiness, the grudges. They saw a queen who ruled less by delegation than by domination, one who micromanaged when she felt insecure and froze out anyone who crossed her. And while they couldn't say it publicly, some longed for a monarch with less feeling and more distance. Still, for all the palace intrigue, Victoria's youth was undeniably magnetic. She was a queen the people loved to watch grow up. But that adoration came at a cost, one she often took out on those closest to her. Which leads us to another royal who captured the public's affection in his youth, even as whispers in royal hallways called him something else entirely: reckless, emotional, and infuriating. Prince Harry, pre-exit, pre-exile, pre-Netflix. 6. Prince Harry, pre-exit era. There was a time, not so long ago, when Prince Harry was the monarchy's safety valve, the rogue with a grin, the cheeky one. If Prince William was duty in a tailored suit, Harry was charisma in uniform, grinning through handshakes and missteps alike. The public adored him for it. He was the prince who high-fived children, hugged strangers, and looked genuinely uncomfortable behind podiums, endearingly out of sync with the formality that clung to his bloodline like dust on a crown. But inside palace walls, away from camera flashes and charity events, Harry was often described with less fondness. Privately, he was considered emotional, hot-headed, unpredictable, a walking contradiction of charm and frustration. Someone who, despite being born into the most famously controlled institution in Britain, had the nerve to feel things, loudly, inconveniently, publicly, that made him a problem. In the years before Megxit, Harry existed in a strange liminal space. Too senior to be ignored, too junior to be taken seriously. To the public, he was the lovable second son, the spare who got stuck with press intrusion and emotional fallout, but none of the ceremonial power. But to many in his own family, he was exhausting. The kind of royal who asked why too often. Why the press got briefings, why the security was unequal, why some royals were protected and others, like his mother, like himself, were left to twist. His frustration was seen as ingratitude, his emotions as weakness, and his efforts to modernize, whether through mental health advocacy or challenging tabloid narratives, were frequently met with rolled eyes behind the scenes. Royals, after all, weren't supposed to explain. They were supposed to endure. Even before his marriage, Harry had a complicated relationship with the palace machinery. He wanted his own staff, his own projects, his own voice. He was tolerated, not embraced. There were whispers that he was difficult to manage, that he clashed with aides, that he had too many opinions for someone with no real constitutional role. And the more he leaned into humanitarian causes, the more apparent the internal contradictions became. Harry wanted to use his position to make noise. The monarchy preferred silence. And then came Meghan. To the public, their relationship was a fairy tale, diverse, modern, romantic. It was a departure from the stale formula of royal unions. But inside the institution, the mood shifted fast. Suddenly, Harry wasn't just the lovable rogue. He was a liability. And not because of who he married, but because of how he responded when the machinery turned on her. Instead of retreating, he fought, loudly, on record. Palace insiders described him as increasingly combative, protective to the point of paranoia, closed off, distrustful, and most damning of all, disloyal. His desire to shield his wife and child from the treatment his mother had endured was seen as insubordination, not empathy. His choices stopped being interpreted through the lens of grief or growth. They were reframed as rebellion. But here's the irony. Even at his most divisive, the public still loved Harry. Surveys often showed higher favorability for him than for senior royals. He retained the aura of authenticity. The wounded, outspoken prince who wanted to break the cycle. To the outside world, that looked like courage. To the inside world, it looked like treason. And long before the interviews, the exit, the documentaries, Harry was already being quietly iced out. Fewer briefings, less inclusion, subtler seating charts. The message was clear. You are either with the institution or you are outside it. There is no halfway balcony. Harry's great mistake wasn't his outbursts or even his departure. It was that he believed the monarchy could evolve with him. But before Harry, there was another golden boy, A future king who smiled for cameras and posed like a statue. But behind the charm, there were flashes of steel. Stubborn, temperamental, and, according to those who worked with him, far more complex than the carefully managed headlines ever let on. Prince William. Before the Polish. Before the crown loomed. When he was just the heir, and already resented for how tightly he gripped the script. 7. Prince William. Younger years. Before he became the polished statesman-in-waiting, the steady hand of the modern monarchy, Prince William was the golden child with a short fuse, and everyone in the palace knew it. To the public, William was the monarchy's redemption arc. The calm after Diana, the stable counterbalance to his more turbulent younger brother. He was tall, well-spoken, photogenic, and apparently allergic to scandal. He waved the right way, wore the right suits, dated the right girl, and never, not once, told the press how he really felt, which was exactly why they adored him. But behind the palace walls, William's golden boy image came with sharp edges. Courtiers who worked with him in his 20s and early 30s often described him as intense, stubborn, and quick to anger when things didn't go his way. He was, even in his youth, unusually conscious of his role and the weight of his image. And if you disrupted the frame, he wasn't shy about letting you know. This wasn't the visible temper of a tyrant. William's frustration simmered, calculated and quiet, usually behind closed doors. He wasn't reckless. He was exacting. Staff members who displeased him weren't yelled at so much as frozen out. His team operated under high standards and higher pressure. The line between loyalty and silence was paper thin, and many who crossed it, often unintentionally, didn't last long. Even as a teenager, William displayed a guardedness that unnerved people. While Harry was open, reactive, and often wore his emotions on his sleeve, William played the long game. He didn't speak unless he meant to. He didn't trust unless he had to. He saw the press as a necessary evil, but rarely forgave them for what they had done to his mother. And that mistrust extended to nearly everyone outside his tightly controlled circle. It wasn't uncommon for courtiers and aides to privately describe him as moody, not cruel, not unreasonable, just opaque, hard to read, harder to reach, a young man who understood power before he had it and made sure you knew that one day you'd answer to him. And yet, the public saw none of it. They saw the charming Eton student, the dashing university boyfriend, the helicopter pilot who insisted on doing real work. They saw a future king who dated one woman, married her after a respectable pause, and rarely, if ever, made the wrong kind of headline. William was a royal Rorschach test. Whatever values you projected onto him, duty, discretion, tradition, he seemed to reflect them right back. But that wasn't the full picture. In private, his relationship with the press was deeply hostile. His relationship with staff, controlled. And his relationship with his brother, already fraying long before the headlines caught up. William's sense of duty didn't just guide him, it hardened him. He viewed royal life not as a burden, but as a fortress, something to be defended, even from within. And in defending that image, he developed an instinct for containment. Where Harry wanted to fix things, William wanted to preserve them. Change was a risk. Emotion was a liability. And anyone, even family, who challenged the system became, by definition, the problem. The irony? It worked. The public still sees him as the balanced one, the grown-up, the responsible adult. But to some inside the institution, William's early years weren't just golden, they were guarded, and sometimes difficult. Which brings us to another royal who made difficult look like a lifestyle. Someone who lit up every room she entered, then made you wish you hadn't invited her. Glamorous, witty, sharp-tongued, and in private, almost universally exhausting, Princess Margaret. 8. Princess Margaret. She was the royal who smoked too much, drank too early, and made staff cry before breakfast. To the world, Princess Margaret was the dazzling little sister, the rebel, the beauty, the scandal magnet with a cigarette holder and a cutting remark for every occasion. In the age of black and white royalty, she was the only one who seemed to live in color. She radiated danger in a dynasty built on dullness, and the public predictably adored her for it. But to those around her, her staff, her family, even her friends, she was something else entirely. Privately, Margaret was a storm system. She didn't just expect deference, she demanded it. Her presence at royal events was often a highlight for the press and a nightmare for those working behind the scenes. She was notorious for changing her mind at the last minute, barking orders mid-ceremony or throwing tantrums over trivial details, like the shade of table linen or the placement of a floral arrangement. Staff memoirs, if you read them carefully, have a particular rhythm when describing her. Admiration, followed by exhaustion. She could be magnetic and witty one minute, and then, in the next breath, she could emotionally flatten a room with a single phrase. She had an exquisite sense of timing when it came to insults, always delivered with perfect diction and a deadpan stare. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Margaret had grown up as the spare long before the term became shorthand for royal second children. But where Harry simmered, Margaret performed. And where Harry eventually walked away, Margaret stayed. And that may have been part of the problem. She never quite figured out how to exist within the system without resenting it. Nor did she figure out how to exist outside of it without losing herself. Her early love affair with Group Captain Peter Townsend, charmingly tragic in hindsight, became the first major public collision between personal desire and institutional expectations. She was forbidden to marry him, and the public, devastated on her behalf, cast her as a victim of the crown. But behind palace doors, some insiders didn't see a wounded romantic. They saw a diva deprived of the spotlight. Later marriages, flings, and party invitations only deepened that perception. Margaret liked to be seen, she liked to be heard. But more than anything, she liked to be obeyed. She expected the monarchy to orbit her, never quite accepting that her role was supporting, not starring. Even within her own family, she was an acquired taste. Queen Elizabeth II, her elder sister, was said to be patient but weary. Their bond, while genuine, was shaped by duty more than affection. Margaret's children had complicated views. Courtiers found her equal parts dazzling and demoralizing. If you worked with her long enough, you learned to measure your success not in praise, but in the absence of insult. Yet to the public, she remained fascinating, the glamorous royal who wore couture to breakfast, who partied with artists, who smoked in silk. She was modernity in heels, at least from a distance. But up close, she was more reminder than revelation. A living portrait of what happens when a royal tries to be exceptional in a role designed for obedience. And speaking of disobedience, the next royal knew all about it, because no one disapproved of him more than his own mother. A man who defined an era with scandal, parties, and women. To the public, a lovable rogue. To the court, a walking diplomatic incident. Edward VII, before the crown ever touched his head. 9. Edward VII, as Prince of Wales. He waited longer to become king than anyone in British history. 59 years in the shadows, wearing a crown of expectation, restraint, and mild contempt. And in all that time, Edward VII managed to become beloved by the public and privately loathed by just about everyone tasked with keeping him out of trouble, including, and especially, his mother. To the British public in the late 19th century, Bertie was the charming, larger-than-life Prince of Wales. He drank with aristocrats, gambled at Monte Carlo, flirted with actresses, and made fashion headlines just by wearing a waistcoat a little differently. He was the royal who felt like a real person, decidedly unstiff, often inappropriate, and, unlike his mother, not allergic to fun. But inside the palace, he was viewed less as a lovable rogue and more as a rolling scandal in tales. Queen Victoria, ever the image of restraint and solemnity, considered her eldest son a monumental disappointment. She saw him as lazy, undisciplined, and dangerously unserious. She rarely allowed him near the mechanisms of power, convinced he would ruin anything he touched, and she wasn't quiet about it. Victoria once wrote that Bertie shows a want of interest in everything great and noble, which is Victorian for, "This man is allergic to responsibility." She blamed him for everything from political missteps to his father's premature death, convinced that Bertie's lifestyle had driven Prince Albert to an early grave. Whether or not that was fair, it cemented a lifelong dynamic. The prince was always performing, and his mother was always disappointed. He wasn't just excluded from serious statecraft. He was exiled from it. Ministers were instructed not to involve him in official matters. His attempts to contribute to governance were rebuffed, often rudely. Even his overseas tours, which were hits with the public, were treated as PR containment exercises rather than diplomatic missions. And it wasn't just his mother who found him exhausting. Courtiers complained that he was undisciplined, prone to excess, and maddeningly indifferent to the responsibilities of his station. He changed his staff frequently. He indulged in everything: food, drink, women, fashion, gossip. He made jokes in rooms where everyone else was holding their breath. And worse, he didn't seem to care. But the public couldn't get enough. In an era of increasingly formal and aloof monarchy, Bertie was approachable. He shook hands. He attended horse races. He knew how to talk to people below his station without condescension. He became a symbol of indulgence during a time when the empire was tightening its moral corset. That disconnect, the widening gulf between how he was perceived by the people and how he was tolerated by the palace, only deepened with age. The more the public embraced him, the more those behind the scenes rolled their eyes. He was the royal family's embarrassing uncle, except he was next in line for the throne. When he finally became king in 1901, to the shock of many, he turned out to be competent. Not visionary, not revolutionary, but stable, measured, even diplomatic. The feared disaster never quite arrived, and the courtiers who had spent decades dreading his reign were left blinking in confusion. But before that redemption arc, before the crown softened his image, Edward was the prince everyone wanted to party with, and no one wanted to be responsible for. And if Edward was the whirlwind, then his wife was the calm. Publicly sainted, privately scrutinized, she played the long game with grace, and just enough manipulation to make her both beloved and quietly resented. Queen Alexandra. 10. Queen Alexandra. She was porcelain with pulse, a queen consort who moved like a shadow and smiled like a statue. To the public, Queen Alexandra was a living saint, elegant, deaf, but dignified, gracious in public and devoted in private. She had style, softness, and stamina. The Victorian ideal of womanhood, just foreign enough to be interesting, just quiet enough to be adored. But within royal circles, Alexandra was far from universally beloved. Beneath the swan-like poise and charitable image was a woman who understood power very well and held on to it long after it was hers to wield. Some called it loyalty, others called it manipulation. As the Danish princess who became the wife of Edward VII, she had a difficult starting hand. She married into a family that viewed outsiders with suspicion and, perhaps worse, manners. Her marriage to Edward, Bertie to his friends and his ever-expanding social circle of mistresses, was a public triumph and a private disappointment. Alexandra played the role of devoted wife with remarkable discipline, even as her husband publicly humiliated her with his parade of affairs. But what the courtiers noticed wasn't just her tolerance, it was her strategy. Alexandra cultivated her own power base. She had allies in the aristocracy, influence over her children, and the kind of ironclad dignity that made criticism seem vulgar. But inside the family, especially among the inner court, she was quietly resented for her tendency to turn every room into a silent performance. She had a flair for theatrical stillness, perfectly styled, never flustered, yet somehow always positioned to draw the gaze. Even her charitable work, though genuinely impactful, had a dramatic edge to it. Her visits to hospitals, her fundraising, her concern for the deaf community, all performed with angelic intensity and press-friendly timing. She was adored by the public as much for what she didn't say as for what she did. She never publicly criticized Edward's behavior, never made scenes, never abandoned her post. But privately, she made it clear to those around her that she was no fool. She was known to freeze out rivals. She undermined mistresses quietly, often through whispers to the right aristocrat or a calculated social snub. And she never let go of her position, even after Edward's death. As Queen Mother to George V, she remained a formidable presence. Most dowager queens fade politely into the background. Alexandra did not. She lingered in court politics, resisted modernization, and subtly challenged her daughter-in-law Mary of Teck's role as the new queen. Even George, her son, found her difficult at times. She clung to past glories, old protocols, and personal grievances like a museum curator who refuses to update the exhibit. To the staff, she could be gracious but icy. Requests were often indirect, delivered through glances or silences. She was exacting without explanation. Servants either adored her or feared her, sometimes both. And yet she never lost the public. Her fashion sense was copied. Her demeanor was praised. Her perceived suffering at the hands of her philandering husband earned her permanent sympathy. She played the tragic queen role so convincingly that few ever questioned how much of it was real, and how much was just excellent stagecraft. Because Alexandra's gift wasn't just surviving a difficult marriage, it was turning that survival into royalty's most untouchable kind of power, quiet martyrdom. But not every royal was so quiet. The next in line didn't suffer silently. He didn't manage scandal, he multiplied it. A king who returned from exile and ruled like every day was a banquet, and every courtier was a waiter he didn't plan to tip. Charles II, the merry monarch. But not so merry behind closed doors. 11. Charles II. He came back to England wearing a crown and a smirk, and for a while the country loved him for both. Charles II, the so-called merry monarch, was the long-awaited balm to a nation that had spent over a decade under Puritan austerity. He restored the monarchy, reopened the theaters, brought back music, fashion, festivals, and a sense of national personality. In portraits, he looked every bit the romantic king, tall, charismatic, dark-eyed, with a wig as enormous as his appetites. He was charming in a way his father never was, and far too clever to martyr himself like him. To the public, he was a breath of rakish fresh air. But to his court, his ministers, advisors, and even his own household, Charles could be maddening, lazy, and impossible to manage. The charm that won the streets wore thin in the corridors of power. He didn't govern so much as delegate, often to the wrong people. His court was bloated with hangers-on, mistresses, favorites, and opportunists, many of whom wielded real influence simply because they made him laugh or turned a blind eye to his excesses. Those who worked for Charles were frequently exhausted, not by his tyranny, but by his indifference. He didn't demand loyalty so much as he demanded presence. Be there, be flattering, be amusing, be available when summoned, and invisible when not. His mistresses were legendary. Nell Gwynn, Barbara Castlemaine, Louise de Querouaille, each one elevated to a sort of parallel court within the court. It wasn't just scandalous, it was strategic. Charles used these relationships to balance factions, reward loyalty, or sometimes just avoid actual governance. Ministers gritted their teeth as policy meetings were delayed by hunting trips or derailed by sudden invitations to private dinners. Foreign envoys learned quickly that diplomacy with Charles was best conducted with a bottle of claret in one hand and flattery in the other. Even his closest advisors found him unpredictable. He would commit to one course of action, then reverse it the next morning, often without explanation. His religious policies were a study in ambiguity, tolerant one moment, cautious the next. Some suspected he secretly leaned Catholic, which in 17th century England was less a personal belief and more a political grenade. But Charles reveled in keeping everyone guessing. He found safety in vagueness and preferred shadows to clarity. It made for captivating leadership, until you had to actually work with him. His court was a hotbed of patronage and gossip, and those who weren't part of the inner circle were often left spinning in confusion. The bureaucracy suffered. Policies were inconsistent. Alliances were made more through personal relationships than any grand vision. And while the public adored their king's rakish grin and defiance of Puritanism, those tasked with maintaining a functioning state often felt like they were staffing a comedy in which they were not allowed to laugh. Despite this, Charles had one consistent advantage. He knew exactly how far to push. He never cracked down too hard, never promised too much, and always made sure that someone else could take the blame. He was a survivor first, a ruler second. But survival often came at the expense of those around him. For every charming anecdote about Charles, there was a minister grinding his teeth at 2 a.m., wondering why government had stalled because His Majesty had gone hawking. Again. And then came his heir. A man who inherited none of the charm, all of the entitlement, and managed to alienate almost everyone who tried to love, serve, or even tolerate him. George IV, when he was still the Prince Regent, a public showman with a private talent for destroying goodwill. 12. George IV, as Prince Regent. He fancied himself a patron of the arts, a man of taste, a king-in-waiting destined to dazzle history with silk gloves and Greco-Roman columns. What George IV became instead, at least to those who had the misfortune of knowing him intimately, was a cautionary tale in velvet. As the Prince Regent, George lived like a monarch without the bother of actual kingship. His father, George III, had gone mad, leaving the governance of Britain in the hands of his flamboyant and increasingly insufferable son. To the public, George was something of a curiosity, extravagant, eccentric, prone to fashion experiments and eye-watering debt, but undeniably charismatic in a larger-than-life parade float kind of way. But to the people around him, his advisors, his servants, even his own family, George was one long, unbroken headache. He didn't just indulge in luxury, he devoured it. Everything about George was excessive. His parties, his wardrobe, his architecture, his appetite. He once commissioned a single jacket that cost more than the average subject earned in a decade. His homes were redesigned with layers of gold leaf, imported silks, and more marble than most ancient empires. And he still wasn't satisfied. Those close to him weren't impressed. They were exhausted. Maintaining the Prince Regent's lifestyle was a full-time job for dozens, and an unpaid emotional labor for hundreds. He had a gift for wearing people down, for consuming the goodwill of even his most loyal supporters. Aides who entered his service optimistic and eager soon found themselves battling a man who combined the sulking of a teenager with the expectations of an emperor. He was, by many accounts, emotionally needy, endlessly vain, and almost allergic to responsibility. Ministers found him inconsistent and maddeningly difficult to brief. He would nod along to discussions of policy and then pivot mid-meeting to complain about the embroidery on his cuff. He made promises he never kept, changed his mind hourly, and blamed everyone else when plans collapsed under the weight of his whims. And yet in public, he dazzled, at least for a time. His love of pageantry, fashion, and spectacle helped revive interest in the monarchy after years of instability. He played the part of a modern royal before the role had been written. Crowds gathered to see his elaborate processions. Artists were commissioned, fountains flowed. But behind the curtain, those tasked with organizing these events whispered in frustration. The prince was impossible to satisfy, yet quick to insult. Courtiers described him as petty and cruel, particularly when he felt bored, which was often. His personal relationships fared no better. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a catastrophe from the outset. He disliked her on sight. She found him insufferable. They separated almost immediately, yet continued to scandalize the court with their mutual animosity, played out in the press like an 18th-century soap opera. Those around them were trapped in the middle, expected to take sides, navigate egos, and clean up the messes left behind like royal janitors. Even George's own siblings and children regarded him with a mix of irritation and distance. He didn't inspire loyalty so much as he extracted it, often with guilt, manipulation, or passive-aggressive snubs. But perhaps most frustrating to those around him was this: he knew exactly how unloved he was, and pretended not to care. Because George IV didn't want to be liked, he wanted to be admired, revered, worshipped even, and when that failed, he would settle for feared. Which makes his successor all the more curious, a queen who mastered the art of admiration while quietly generating a circle of fear, fatigue, and deeply buried resentment among the very people she trusted most. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, publicly adored, privately, something else entirely. 13. Elizabeth I. She ruled with grace, fire, and a wardrobe that could bankrupt a duchy. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the flame-haired icon, was more than just England's monarch, she was its myth. To the public, she was untouchable. A divine figure cloaked in silks and rhetoric, waging war on Spain, outwitting suitors, and elevating her country to global greatness. But behind the myth, in the smoky halls of her court, Elizabeth inspired not just admiration, but dread. Because to serve her was to live in suspense. She was charming when she wanted to be, brilliant always. But for those in her inner circle, counselors, diplomats, ladies-in-waiting, and aging suitors, Elizabeth was not a goddess. She was a dangerously intelligent woman with a gift for punishment, a taste for manipulation, and an instinct for survival so honed it bordered on the pathological. The adoration she inspired among the English people was very real. They saw her as the savior of Protestant England, the cunning tactician who danced around foreign kings and homegrown traitors. They cheered her speeches, they whispered legends about her virginity, they forgave her taxes. But those who actually knew her, those who sat through her silences, parsed her temper, or waited days for her to sign a simple document, often lived in quiet, exhausted terror. Elizabeth wielded power not through brute force, but psychological pressure. She delayed decisions until her ministers squirmed. She dangled favors and withheld them with surgical cruelty. She demanded loyalty and gave little in return. Her court was less a circle of trusted advisors and more a chessboard. She moved her pieces carefully, and when a bishop got too ambitious or a knight began to look too independent, she removed them, politely, strategically, irrevocably. Even her closest confidants, men like William Cecil and Robert Dudley, walked on a tightrope. One wrong letter, one poorly timed piece of advice, and decades of service could vanish under a wave of icy silence. And no one held a grudge like Elizabeth. She never forgot a slight. She never truly forgave an insult. Her memory was sharp, long, and lethal. She was just as exacting with her ladies-in-waiting. They were expected to be beautiful, obedient, unmarried, and never, under any circumstances, more admired than she was. Those who flirted with courtiers without her approval were banished. Those who married in secret were disgraced. Elizabeth didn't just control politics. She controlled the emotional oxygen in every room she entered. Marriage proposals? She collected them like trophies, then discarded them. Not because she didn't want companionship. She did. But because she valued control more. Even the idea of sharing power repelled her. And every noble in England knew it. Suitors came and went, often humiliated. Alliances were built on hope, then dashed on a single, well-crafted rejection. And yet, despite her tyranny of tone and talent, for keeping everyone guessing, she got results. England grew richer. Its navy stronger. Its culture flourished. Her subjects loved her because she knew exactly how to be adored by people who would never meet her, and feared by everyone who did. The mystery of Elizabeth wasn't whether she was good or bad. It was how long people could survive in her orbit without burning out. Because love, in Elizabeth's court, was a performance. Loyalty was a test with no correct answer. And nowhere was that more apparent than with the man who stood beside her in every photograph of her modern descendants. Never smiling too wide, never speaking too freely, and never quite invited into the myth. Prince Philip, the Duke, the consort. And behind palace doors, the man they couldn't quite tame. 14. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. He was the man who walked 2 steps behind the Queen and about 5 steps ahead of everyone else when it came to saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. To the public, Prince Philip was a paradox, equal parts national treasure and national embarrassment. The long-serving consort who seemed carved from granite and wrapped in British understatement. He unveiled plaques, crashed Land Rovers, and made deeply uncomfortable small talk with foreign dignitaries. He was a mainstay of royal life, stoic, reliable, slightly terrifying. But within the palace walls, among the aides, staff, and family who dealt with him daily, he was often seen as something else entirely. Blunt, demanding, intolerant of incompetence, brilliant but brutal. Philip's life was marked by displacement. Born a Greek prince, exiled in infancy, shuffled through European royalty like diplomatic luggage. By the time he married Elizabeth, he had already learned the golden rule of surviving aristocracy: never show weakness and never let anyone else steer. That made life inside Buckingham Palace complicated. He wasn't built for subservience, yet subservience was the job. As consort, Philip had no constitutional role, no real authority, and no natural place in the machinery of the monarchy. So he carved one out, with sharp elbows. Courtiers didn't always appreciate it. He reorganized the palace staff, restructured finances, and bulldozed traditions that had stood for centuries. Some saw this as necessary modernization. Others saw it as meddling from a man who wasn't supposed to have a voice. Philip's reforms were practical, but his methods left bruises. He had no patience for dithering or sentimentality. If something was broken, it needed to be fixed. If someone was slow, they needed to be replaced. If a plan was inefficient, it needed to be scrapped, ideally with a few withering comments along the way. He often clashed with palace aides. He referred to them, not always affectionately, as the firm within the firm. Staff described him as irascible, unfiltered, and deeply uninterested in niceties. He didn't just ignore protocol, he occasionally mocked it. And while he loathed the press, he seemed to delight in giving them material. He once quipped to an ambassador, "If you stay here much longer, you'll all be slitty-eyed." And to a student on a school trip to space camp, "You're too fat to be an astronaut." These weren't diplomatic blunders. They were Prince Philip's version of small talk, abrasive, tone-deaf, and, in some cases, devastating. Even within his own family, his relationships were complex. He was a strict father, particularly with Charles, whom he viewed as overly sensitive and too introspective. He tried to harden his son the way he had hardened himself, through expectation, discipline, and a strict sense of masculinity. It didn't always work. Their bond, such as it was more military than emotional. And more than a few insiders suspected that this distance shaped the next generation in ways no one dared to discuss out loud. Yet to the Queen, he was indispensable. Their dynamic, private, sealed, untouchable, was the one relationship in royal life no one fully understood. And while the public warmed to Philip with time, many inside the palace never did. He was too sharp, too honest, too unwilling to play the gentle background role expected of a royal accessory. And when he did try to play nice, it came with a side of sarcasm and a barely concealed eye roll. Still, Philip's legacy was unmistakable. He pushed the monarchy to modernize, even when it hated him for it. Which brings us to the man who inherited more than just a title. He inherited the pressure, the cold rooms, the comparisons, and the simmering resentment. Prince Charles, or as we now know him, King Charles III, But once upon a time, he was just the heir with a crown-shaped burden and a reputation for being impossible. 15. Prince Charles, later Charles III. He spent the better part of 7 decades rehearsing for a job no one seemed eager for him to inherit, including, at times, his own family. To the public, especially in later years, Charles was increasingly viewed with cautious sympathy. The world had watched him age beneath a crown that hovered just out of reach. He was the prince who waited, the husband who mourned Diana poorly, the man who talked to plants and promoted organic farming before it was fashionable. There was something oddly endearing about how out of sync he often appeared with the times. But within palace walls, Charles was frequently considered a nightmare to manage, fussy, sensitive, self-important, and endlessly exhausting. He was not born into warmth. His childhood was more schedule than sentiment, and that cold, structured upbringing followed him into adulthood. Charles developed a deep inner world, complete with elaborate routines, spiritual fixations, and a Rolodex of grievances that expanded with age. Courtiers and aides, those who worked with him directly, often described the prince as both high-minded and high-maintenance. One former valet revealed Charles's morning routine involved having his shoelaces ironed, his bath drawn to an exact temperature, and his breakfast arranged with architectural precision. His staff memorized not just preferences, but emotional landmines. He could be warm and deeply thoughtful one day, icy and withdrawn the next. And unlike his mother, who favored calm indifference, Charles preferred intensity. He felt things. Out loud. That didn't always play well with those around him. He was deeply political, unofficially, of course, which made many senior royals and government officials uneasy. His famous Black Spider memos, handwritten letters to ministers and policymakers, revealed a man who had never been fully comfortable staying out of public affairs. He saw the role of monarch-in-waiting not as ceremonial, but as moral stewardship. In theory, noble. In practice, awkward. Even his causes, many of them admirable, were often pursued with a level of obsession that alienated those meant to help him. He could be single-minded, pedantic, and utterly disinterested in compromise. Those who dared disagree with him, even on matters of scheduling or press strategy, were met with coldness or outright dismissal. Staff turnover in his household was famously high. And then there was his public image, the eternal crisis. Charles was haunted by the ghost of his first wife's popularity. Diana's death made her a global saint and left Charles wearing the villain's crown in a narrative he couldn't rewrite. His marriage to Camilla, the great scandal of the late 20th century, remained a sore point for years. The public eventually softened. The palace? Less so. Many insiders viewed the relationship as a mistake managed with stubborn defiance rather than tact. Charles's tendency to demand loyalty while simultaneously doubting everyone's motives left his inner circle in a permanent state of caution. Even his own sons, at different times, found him emotionally distant and bewildering. He wanted to be loved, but often led with entitlement. And yet, like so many royals on this list, Charles managed to be more liked by strangers than by those closest to him. From afar, he seemed thoughtful, concerned with the planet, occasionally misunderstood. Up close, he was harder to define, a man of conviction and contradiction, insecurity cloaked in ceremony. But Charles didn't invent that balancing act. Centuries earlier, another court had watched a woman rise from the margins to the throne, adored by the public, but loathed in whispers by the very nobility who once raised their cups to her. Anne Boleyn, queen consort, court favorite, and for many behind the velvet curtains, the original royal mistake. 16. Anne Boleyn. She arrived at the Tudor court like a spark in a powder room, fashionable, clever, and absolutely unwilling to fade into the background. To the English public, Anne Boleyn was a magnetic force, a trend-setting marvel whose French-influenced style and sharp wit captivated a king and changed the course of history. She wasn't just the woman Henry VIII wanted. She was the woman he was willing to tear his entire kingdom apart to marry. But inside the court, beyond the jewelry and courtly masks, Anne was a scandal with legs. A woman who made enemies faster than she made headlines, and who managed to be both envied and despised in equal measure. Her public rise was meteoric. She refused to be just another royal mistress, instead demanding and receiving a crown. She became the face of England's break with Rome, the queen who promised to deliver a new royal dynasty and a new moral order. But the court didn't see a reformer. They saw a disruptor. And more than that, they saw a woman who didn't know her place. Anne didn't play the docile queen-in-waiting. She was sharp-tongued, politically ambitious, and dangerously aware of her influence. She alienated many of the traditionalist nobles who had supported Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, and she showed little patience for anyone who questioned her new authority. She rewarded loyalists and froze out skeptics. She promoted her family, particularly her brother, George, with a vigor that looked less like strategy and more like nepotism to her critics. Ladies at court found her insufferable. She was known to insult those she viewed as inferior, including foreign dignitaries, noblewomen, and servants. Her confidence read as arrogance, her assertiveness as insolence. Even those who admired her wit quietly admitted she was terrifying in private conversation. Courtiers lived in fear of her moods, one day effusive, the next scathing. She was unpredictable, and in a world where predictability meant survival, that made her dangerous. She also suffered from a uniquely fatal problem. She was blamed for the king's behavior. Henry's treatment of Catherine, his break with the Pope, the religious chaos that followed, it was all, in the minds of many courtiers and clergy, Anne's fault. She wasn't simply unpopular, she was the physical embodiment of a national upheaval. Her failure to produce a male heir only deepened the resentment. Though she gave birth to the future Elizabeth I, the court viewed it as a disappointment. Whispers began that she was cursed, that she had bewitched the king, that this whole marriage had been a mistake carved in ambition and dressed in French lace. Even her allies grew cautious. The Boleyns had gained power too quickly, and no one climbs that fast in court without making a long list of people eager to push you down. By the time her downfall came, many were already measuring the distance to the ground, and yet the public, at least parts of it, remained enchanted. Anne's charisma had reached beyond the court's whisper network. She was the modern woman in a medieval world, the queen who spoke her mind, championed reform, and refused to be a silent figurehead. But those same traits made her, in the eyes of many, impossible. And in a court where being difficult was often deadlier than being dishonest, Anne's days were always numbered. Which brings us to another royal who wore popularity like a crown, but ruled from behind the scenes with a fragile constitution, a hidden temper, and a reputation for cracking under pressure, especially when the microphones were off and the stakes were high. George VI, the reluctant king, the symbol of strength. And to some around him, a man barely holding it together. 17. George VI. He never wanted the job, which, ironically, made him the perfect person for it. To the public, George VI was the quiet hero, the wartime king who refused to flee London during the Blitz, the stammering monarch who found his voice just in time to rally a nation, the reluctant ruler who held the crumbling edges of an empire together with little more than loyalty and clenched teeth. He was stability made flesh, duty personified. And when he died young, the public mourned him like a favorite uncle, reserved, dependable, and ultimately tragic. But to those inside the palace, George VI was far more complicated. He may have been noble and dutiful, but he was also brittle, anxious, and at times, deeply difficult to manage. Behind the myth of the steady king was a man whose fragility required careful choreography by the people who served him. His private world was one of tension, not triumph. Born as Prince Albert, known as Bertie to his family, he was the spare who never expected to rule. Shy, introverted, and prone to crippling anxiety, he was deeply overshadowed by his older brother Edward, who charmed rooms effortlessly and self-destructed with equal flair. When Edward abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, Bertie didn't ascend to the throne. He was pushed onto it, like a man shoved onto a stage he never auditioned for. His staff understood immediately what the public didn't. This king was terrified. George VI was plagued by a lifelong stammer, a physical symptom of emotional tension that required constant effort to manage. Every speech, every radio broadcast was a battlefield. His team rehearsed endlessly with him, and many staff members admitted privately that working under the king was like operating under permanent crisis mode. Not because he was volatile, but because he was delicate. He demanded precision in everything. Not out of arrogance, but because disorder unsettled him. His personal routines were rigid. His preferences were law. Disruption, even in small forms, could throw off his entire day. Courtiers described walking on eggshells around him, not because he would explode, but because he might silently spiral. If his morning routine was altered, if his valet wasn't available, or his papers were misarranged, he could become withdrawn, irritable, or silently furious. He wasn't unkind, but he was tightly wound. Even his own family occasionally found him hard to read. He was fiercely devoted to his wife, Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, and protective of his daughters. But emotionally open? Rarely. He confided in very few, and those he did trust often carried the emotional burden of that trust for years. Ministers respected him, but also worked around him. He was earnest, but not politically shrewd. When Winston Churchill returned as Prime Minister during the war, their dynamic was awkward at best. Churchill dramatic and theatrical, George cautious and detail-obsessed. The king supported him, but with the silent discomfort of a man who preferred certainty to spectacle. Still, the public never saw this version of him. They saw the courage, the broadcasts, the visits to bombed cities. And it wasn't false. George VI truly did rise to the occasion. But those who stood close enough could see that the strength came at a price. Every smile cost him. Every word was a war. And perhaps that's why the next royal, another queen, another foreign-born mother figure, struggled to command the same sympathy. She wielded power just as fiercely, but lacked the public's full embrace. A woman seen as a protector by some, and a puppet master by others. Mary of Guise, the Queen Mother of Scotland, and a walking lesson in what happens when power wears the wrong accent. 18. Mary of Guise. She came from France with silk in her luggage and steel in her spine. Mary of Guise, mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, wasn't just a queen consort. She was a strategist, a survivor, and eventually, a regent who ruled a deeply divided Scotland with a calm hand and a cold eye. To the Scottish public, especially Catholic loyalists, she was dignified and devoted, a widow who stayed behind to raise a daughter and protect a throne. To foreign courts, she was poised, diplomatic, and brilliantly positioned between two Catholic. 18. Mary of Guise. She came from France with silk in her luggage and steel in her spine. Mary of Guise, mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, wasn't just a queen consort. She was a strategist, a survivor, and eventually, a regent who ruled a deeply divided Scotland with a calm hand and a cold eye. To the Scottish public, especially Catholic loyalists, she was dignified and devoted, a widow who stayed behind to raise a daughter and protect a throne. To foreign courts, she was poised, diplomatic, and brilliantly positioned between two Catholic giants, France and the Holy Roman Empire. But inside Scotland's noble class, among the lords and lairds who fancied themselves kings in their own glens, Mary of Guise was many things, but beloved was rarely one of them. Her unpopularity had little to do with her character and everything to do with what she represented: foreign control, female authority, and the terrifying idea that the monarchy might become more centralized and less flattering to local egos. Mary had married James V of Scotland in 1538 as a political alliance, bringing with her not only status but also the full weight of her powerful French family, the House of Guise. After James died suddenly in 1542, leaving behind a 6-day-old daughter and a realm in chaos, Mary stayed. She didn't return to France, as many assumed she would. Instead, she chose to fight for her daughter's crown in a country that barely wanted her in the first place. At first, she tried to play nice. She kept a low profile, allowed Scottish regents to do their posturing, and waited. But in 1554, with political cracks spreading and Protestant factions gaining power, Mary of Guise took the reins herself. Officially installed as regent for her young daughter, she stepped out of the shadows and straight into a hornet's nest. Many Scottish nobles loathed her almost instantly, not just because she was French or Catholic, but because she was competent. She replaced disloyal men with loyal ones, enforced royal authority over local factions, and, most unforgivably, sought to modernize governance by reducing the chaotic independence of the nobility. That, in Scotland, was practically heresy. The Protestant Reformation was gaining speed, and Mary, despite her diplomatic instincts, couldn't outmaneuver its religious zeal. Reformers painted her as a foreign puppet of the Pope. Her attempts at compromise were interpreted as manipulation. Her calm demeanor was reframed as cold detachment. Even her supporters began to doubt her as political tensions escalated. She was seen as distant, regal to a fault, and increasingly isolated. Her use of French advisors and troops to maintain order only worsened public perception. To the Protestant lords, she wasn't just a regent. She was an invader in pearls. And yet, she held the country together far longer than anyone expected. She walked a political tightrope between English hostility, internal rebellion, and the looming shadow of civil war. But by 1560, her health failed just as her alliances frayed. 19. Richard the Lionheart. He was England's warrior king, the crusader in shining mail, the icon of medieval chivalry, the monarch who rarely saw his own kingdom, but somehow became its mythic symbol. Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, remains one of the most glorified figures in British history. His statue still stands outside the Houses of Parliament, sword aloft, gaze fixed in eternal battle readiness. But to those who actually lived and worked under him, Richard was less of a lion and more of an absentee landlord with expensive habits and a short fuse. He spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign on English soil. To the public, that was a footnote. To his advisors, nobles, and treasury officials, it was a logistical nightmare. Richard came to power in 1189 with one priority: crusade. Glory in the Holy Land, honor in battle, drama in full plate armor. He viewed the kingship not as stewardship over a nation, but as a funding mechanism for personal heroism. He famously declared he would have sold London itself to finance the Crusades, if only he could find a buyer. And finance them he did, by squeezing England dry. Courtiers, barons, and royal administrators were pressed relentlessly for funds. Offices were sold, titles auctioned off. Even sheriff's positions were handed to the highest bidder. Everything was monetized. Everyone was taxed. The country became a piggy bank for a king it barely saw. While Richard rode into history books under golden banners, his justiciars, those left behind to govern, faced rebellion, resentment, and chaos. His brother John, given a sliver of power during Richard's absence, stirred trouble at home and courted enemies abroad. Meanwhile, the nobility found themselves forced into loyalty to a king who didn't bother with diplomacy or flattery, and who returned only when his wars or ransoms required another round of national funding. Because the crusade wasn't Richard's only grand adventure, it was just the start. He was captured in Austria on his way back from Jerusalem and held for an enormous ransom. England paid it. Of course, It nearly bankrupted the kingdom. His courtiers didn't cheer his return. They braced for the next crisis. Despite all this, the public image of Richard remained strangely untouched. Chroniclers lauded his bravery. Songs were sung in his name. The fact that he barely spoke English, preferred Aquitaine, and seemed vaguely annoyed by administrative duties didn't seem to matter. People wanted a hero, and Richard, however distant, however destructive, fit the mold. But those inside the royal court knew better. He was impulsive, uninterested in governance, and disdainful of court rituals. His advisors found him hard to predict and harder to influence. He trusted few and delegated with suspicion. Diplomacy was foreign to him unless it was backed by swords. And once the cheering stopped, someone else had to fix what he broke. Richard's reign left behind a country bruised by taxes, strained by neglect, and governed by a system constantly forced to compensate for its monarch's absence. And yet, his legend endured, because legends are easier to admire when they're not in the room. The same couldn't be said for his descendant, several generations down the line. A king who didn't disappear but bore down with full force on his subjects, his enemies, and even his allies. A hero to English crowds, a nightmare to everyone else. Edward Werft's Hammer of the Scots, and to many of his contemporaries, Hammer of Patience. 20. Edward Werft. They called him the Hammer of the Scots, which tells you everything about his reputation, and very little about what it was like to be in his presence. Edward I, the tall, iron-willed Plantagenet king, is remembered in English lore as a nation builder, a reformer, and a military strategist who turned barons into bureaucrats and castles into policy. To the public, especially the English public, he was a strong king in a time of scattered loyalties. A ruler who expanded royal authority, crushed rebellion, and carved his will into stone and statute. He was law, order, and justice on horseback. But to those who served under him, fought beside him, or, unluckily, tried to negotiate with him, Edward I was something else entirely, exhausting. Inside his own court, Edward inspired a blend of admiration, fear, and deep fatigue. He was relentless in ambition and equally relentless in expectation. He did not tolerate incompetence, hesitation, or disloyalty. His commands came fast and with little margin for debate. Ministers, clerks, and courtiers described working under Edward as a full-contact sport. There were no soft meetings, no easy audiences. You were either part of his momentum, or you were in the way. He reorganized English law with impressive precision, but he also micromanaged it. His legislative reforms, while groundbreaking, required painstaking attention to detail from staff who were often left scrambling to keep up with his pace. He dictated letters at all hours. He personally oversaw legal reviews. And if something didn't meet his standards, he would often rewrite it himself, while making it known just how little faith he had in those who couldn't get it right the first time. Edward's reign was, in many ways, a masterclass in forceful administration. But it came at a cost. The nobles who once ruled like semi-independent warlords were now reined in, taxed, and audited. Many resented him for it, not because they thought he was incompetent, but because he was inflexible. He ruled through legal domination and sheer stamina, and he didn't care if you liked him, only that you obeyed. Then there was his relationship with Scotland. What began as arbitration quickly turned into occupation. His treatment of Scottish nobles, stripping them of autonomy, symbols, and dignity, was not just politically calculated, but personally driven. Edward demanded submission, and when he didn't get it, he responded with scorched earth and siege towers. The English celebrated him as a patriot. The Scots called him a tyrant. His own court? They called him difficult. His temper, while not explosive in the theatrical sense, was ice-cold and long-lasting. He didn't forget betrayals. He didn't soften with time. He could hold a grudge longer than most kings held a crown. Even his closest allies were cautious around him. He ruled not with affection, but with force wrapped in legal justification. Yet despite the iron grip, he inspired loyalty, mostly out of awe, rarely out of love. He didn't charm, he commanded, and while his legacy includes parliamentary reform and stronger royal authority, it also left behind a court system overworked, a nobility politically declawed, and a trail of strained alliances masked with polite silence. Because Edward didn't just conquer territories. He conquered people, emotionally, administratively, politically, and he expected them to thank him for it. But history has a taste for irony. After Edward's death, his son undid much of what he had built. And in the centuries to follow, a very different kind of king would rise, still victorious in battle, still loved by legend, but feared for a ruthlessness that wore a smile. Henry V, the Golden Warrior. But for those behind the throne, the Golden Headache. 21. Henry V. In Shakespeare's hands, he was a warrior poet, a king who inspired with speeches and conquered with grace. To the English public, he became the very model of medieval kingship. Victorious at Agincourt, wise beyond his years, and wrapped in divine favor. Henry V was the golden boy of English history, young, brave, brilliant, and gone too soon. But behind the heraldry and patriotic fanfare was a ruler whose own court often found him unrelenting, unbending, and, in private, increasingly hard to like. Henry's reign was short, just 9 years, but he packed enough ambition into that span to exhaust an entire generation of advisors. His charisma was undeniable, and his public persona, pious, restrained, utterly devoted to duty, was carefully cultivated. Yet within the corridors of power, he was seen as obsessive, harsh in judgment, and chillingly efficient. He expected perfection and tolerated little else. From the moment he took the throne in 1413, Henry signaled that things were going to change. The wild, rebellious Prince Hal of his youth, the tavern-hopping heir with a reputation for irresponsibility, was gone. In his place stood a king who ruled with a sense of divine mission and a schedule that resembled a military campaign. He purged his father's court of dead weight, silenced dissent with bureaucratic speed, and demanded absolute loyalty. That abrupt shift didn't sit well with everyone. Ministers and nobles who had expected some level of compromise from the young king quickly discovered there would be none. Henry saw his rule as ordained. He believed not just in monarchy, but in monarchy done right, by his standards. His style was rigid, and his court, though efficient, grew cold. Even his generosity, of which there was plenty, came with strings attached: performance, piety, and silence. He launched his famous invasion of France in 1415 with masterful planning, but his expectations for his staff and generals bordered on impossible. He wrote his own dispatches, micromanaged supplies, and personally reviewed decisions most monarchs left to others. Victory at Agincourt immortalized him, but for the men behind the throne, it also cemented a precedent of exacting oversight. There were no off days, no excuses. Henry didn't simply expect success. He expected submission to his version of it. His use of martial law, both abroad and at home, made many in the upper ranks nervous. He ruled through discipline, and discipline was often code for suppression. Dissenters, both political and religious, were dealt with swiftly. The Lollards, a proto-Protestant movement that challenged church orthodoxy, were crushed under Henry's policies. His advisors may have agreed with the goal, but many were uneasy with the force. It was clear that Henry wasn't ruling just to maintain order. He was ruling to install a vision, one that left no room for deviation. His court was lean, loyal, and highly competent, but it was also suffocating. People performed, not out of admiration, but out of fear. Fear of falling short, fear of public correction, fear of being dismissed by a king who didn't believe in second chances. And still, the public adored him. He had the crown, the victory, the legend. But the people who worked closest to him didn't see a saint. They saw a ruler who never truly relaxed, never truly forgave, and never allowed his kingdom, let alone his household, to breathe. And after Henry came a queen who carried her own moral burden, hailed for her faith, praised for her strength, yet quietly condemned for the price of her crown. A daughter who dethroned her father, and in doing so, invited both reverence and quiet revulsion. Mary II, beloved by many, trusted by few. 22. Mary II. She's remembered as the gentle face of the glorious Revolution, a Protestant heroine who brought peace, stability, and constitutional order to a deeply fractured kingdom. Mary II, reigning jointly with her husband William III, is often cast as the dutiful daughter who did what had to be done, replacing her Catholic father, James II, in order to preserve Protestant England from tyranny and religious chaos. To the public, especially those tired of absolutism and fearful of papal influence, she was something of a savior. Gracious, composed, pious. A queen who didn't seek the crown, but accepted it for the good of the realm. But behind the court's velvet drapes, Mary's rise to power left a bitter aftertaste. To many in her own circle, relatives, courtiers, clergymen, her decision to dethrone her father wasn't an act of noble sacrifice. It was an unforgivable breach of royal and familial loyalty. Whispers of betrayal followed her into every drawing room. Mary's marriage to William of Orange was political from the start. As the Protestant heir of James II, she was a valuable chess piece. William, cold and pragmatic, saw the potential of his wife's English claim. Mary, younger and more emotional, saw a marriage shaped by duty more than affection. Their reign would come to reflect exactly that: strategic unity in public, complex distance in private. When her father was overthrown during the Revolution of 1688, Mary didn't protest. She sailed to England, accepted the new political arrangement, and with William, became co-monarch. Her composure was praised, her piety admired. But among certain nobles and courtiers, there was discomfort that never quite resolved. It wasn't just that she'd accepted the crown. It was that she seemed to wear it well. While Mary maintained an image of passive obedience to her husband's leadership, those in her household knew better. During William's absences, when he was abroad waging wars or managing Dutch affairs, Mary ruled alone. And she ruled well. Efficient, steady, and politically astute. She met with ministers, made military decisions, and handled internal tensions with a firm grace that surprised even her critics. But this only deepened the irony. For all her visible religiosity and outward modesty, Mary could be intensely assertive in private governance. Her court was tightly controlled. She disliked disorder and had no patience for dissent. Staff who disappointed her were removed quietly, and once her mind was made up, few could change it. She was also deeply judgmental. Her personal morality shaped her political instincts. She purged her household of anyone she viewed as scandalous or morally lax, often based on little more than reputation. Some saw this as principled leadership. Others as sanctimonious control. Even her personal relationships bore the mark of distance. Her younger sister Anne, later Queen Anne, grew increasingly estranged from Mary during her reign. The reasons were layered: politics, religion, court favoritism. But under it all was a sense that Mary's crown had come at too high a cost for forgiveness to flourish. And yet, the public never turned on her. They saw the queen who didn't flinch, who kept England Protestant, who didn't shed tears in public, even as she buried both her father's reign and, eventually, her own fragile health. Because Mary wasn't meant to be a revolutionary. But that's exactly what she became. And while she died beloved, the next royal in our parade of contradictions lived beloved. Too beloved, perhaps, for a man with secrets, debts, and a flair for igniting scandal, even in a perfectly tailored uniform. Prince George, Duke of Kent, the Royal Gatsby, and a headache in epaulettes. 23. Prince George, Duke of Kent. He was the royal family's dashing enigma, movie star handsome, impeccably dressed, and forever half-shadowed by the kind of rumors that no one confirmed, but everyone repeated. Prince George, Duke of Kent, lived fast, dressed beautifully, and seemed to slip through royal protocol like silk through fingers. To the public, he was a glamorous escape from the gray monotony of royal life between wars. The younger brother of Edward VIII and George VI, he embodied a kind of elegant rebellion that never quite tipped into disgrace. Crowds adored him. Society pages chronicled him. He seemed to belong more on a yacht off the Amalfi Coast than in the drafty halls of Windsor. But within royal circles, especially the tightly wound ecosystem of palace insiders and career courtiers, Prince George was a source of permanent unease. He was charming, yes, brilliant in flashes, but he was also a logistical nightmare. His personal life was a minefield. His relationships, both platonic and otherwise, crossed social, political, and sometimes moral boundaries that made Buckingham Palace exceedingly nervous. At a time when image was everything and discretion was survival, George had a habit of playing with fire and inviting everyone to watch. His inner circle was a dizzying carousel of aristocrats, artists, actors, and individuals whose presence at court events made officials wince. The phrase unsuitable companions was practically invented for him. Courtiers tasked with managing his schedule often found themselves in the impossible position of crafting excuses, smoothing reputations, and quietly pulling names from guest lists at the last minute. There were also the debts. Prince George lived extravagantly, beyond even royal standards. He was a man of expensive tastes: fast cars, tailored clothes, art, fine dining, and a social calendar that could make a Hollywood producer nervous. He wasn't just financially reckless. He was indifferent to consequence. Advisors pleaded with him to scale back. His siblings, especially the more reserved George VI, were reportedly appalled by his lack of restraint. But it wasn't just about money or friends. It was about unpredictability. One day he could be deeply engaged in royal duties, speaking passionately about military reform or advocating for the arts. The next, he would vanish into private retreats, unreachable, his whereabouts left to frantic speculation and carefully worded press releases. He served in the military and held a range of public roles, but many insiders quietly questioned whether he was ever fully committed to the idea of service. He treated royal responsibility like a performance, something to be done with flair, but not too often. His charisma was real, but it wore thin behind the scenes. Despite all this, the public never seemed to fall out of love with him. His death in a plane crash in 1942, while serving in the Royal Air Force, only solidified his legend. A beautiful man, gone too soon, wrapped in mystery and uniforms. He was mourned like a fallen star. But to those who had managed the chaos, soothed the monarch, and kept the scandals just below boiling, his loss was bittersweet. Because while George was beloved, he was also exhausting, the kind of royal who sparkled in public and frayed everyone in private. And he wasn't the only one. Because just across the family tree stood another duke, this one moody, sharp-tempered, and far less interested in charm. A man adored abroad, but whose private storms made him an unpredictable presence within his own bloodline. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. Sailor, Duke, and privately, a royal people braced themselves to serve. 24. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. He was Queen Victoria's second son, the one who didn't have to be king and, according to some who worked with him, behaved like he resented it. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh and later Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a man of rank, duty, and international acclaim, a naval hero, a patron of science and music, a figure celebrated abroad for his diplomacy and discipline. But inside his own family, and particularly within his own staff, Alfred was considered something of a royal thundercloud, brooding, sharp-tempered, and perpetually one sideways comment away from snapping. To the British public, he was the responsible one. While his older brother, the future Edward VII, wasted years in scandal and self-indulgence, Alfred made a name for himself in the Royal Navy. He rose through the ranks with real skill, eventually becoming Admiral of the Fleet. Foreign dignitaries admired him. Colonies welcomed him. He was even offered the throne of Greece, an offer the British government declined on his behalf, fearing it might complicate diplomatic relations. But the same qualities that made him effective abroad, precision, hierarchy, formality, made him difficult at home. Palace insiders often found him cold and rigid. He treated household staff like subordinates in a military chain of command. There was little room for error, none for familiarity. His moods were unpredictable, and when displeased, he could be cutting in ways that left even seasoned aides shaken. One wrong remark, a missed cue, a botched protocol, and the air would grow several degrees colder. He wasn't interested in playing the part of the affable royal. There were no warm smiles for the press, no casual banter with well-wishers. He performed his duties with the air of a man enduring something beneath him. He didn't court popularity, and within the royal household it showed. Even among his siblings, Alfred often stood apart. His relationship with Edward VII was distant and strained. With Victoria, chilly but dutiful. The Queen admired his competence but found him difficult. He was often too blunt, too opinionated, too inflexible. She once remarked that he lacked the winning manners of his brother, which from Victoria was both a critique and a eulogy. His marriage to Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia didn't soften his edges. If anything, it doubled them. Maria, proud and equally high-strung, clashed with British customs and courtiers. The two formed a prickly power couple who were admired in photographs and avoided at dinners. Their household became known for its tense atmosphere, its rigid protocols, and a sense of emotional frost that rarely thawed. Yet Alfred excelled in ceremonial roles, particularly abroad. He was respected, even admired, in Germany and across Europe. His intelligence, discipline, and fluency in several languages made him a favorite among foreign royals. It was at home, among the people who served him daily, that his legacy was more complicated. There, he was seen as harsh, moody, and impossible to please. He wasn't a disaster, far from it. But he was the kind of royal who inspired a certain kind of loyalty, the quiet, clenched jaw kind, the kind where staff saluted when they wanted to sigh. And speaking of sighs, there was another royal woman, born just a few years after Alfred, who inspired both admiration and eye rolls, brilliant, creative, fiercely independent, and utterly impossible to manage. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, sculptor, feminist, and the family's most gloriously insubordinate daughter, 25. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. She was born into a family of rigid protocol and instantly made it her mission to ignore most of it. Princess Louise, the sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was never built for life as a decorative royal. She was whip-smart, fiercely creative, and allergic to conformity. In portraits, she looks appropriately regal. But look closely, and you can almost see the raised eyebrow, the veiled impatience, the sense that she's about 10 seconds away from walking out of frame. To the public, she was something of a marvel. She sculpted, she painted. She supported women's education and workers' rights. She championed the arts, visited hospitals, and occasionally scandalized polite society by having strong opinions in her own voice. She was the modern royal before that phrase had a marketing team. Admirers saw her as proof that a woman born into privilege could still be progressive, intelligent, and independently minded. But inside the royal household, Louise was viewed with a mix of exasperation and dread. She broke the mold, but more importantly, she did it on purpose. Where her sisters followed duty like a hymn, Louise questioned it. Where her brothers enjoyed inherited roles, she earned her own. She studied sculpture seriously, under real professionals, and submitted work anonymously to exhibitions. She even had the audacity to be good. Not royal good, actually good. That alone ruffled feathers. Royals weren't supposed to be professional anything, much less successful in fields they weren't born into. Courtiers didn't know what to do with her. Her household staff found her independent to the point of confrontation. She could be warm, generous, and inspiring, but also temperamental, sarcastic, and utterly intolerant of sycophants. Louise's relationship with her mother didn't help matters. Queen Victoria reportedly found her daughter's sharp tongue and refusal to flatter authority more than a little irritating. Their exchanges could be combative. Louise once described her mother's court as morbid and dull, which, in Victorian terms, is basically a thrown drink. She hated the mourning clothes, the emotional repression, the endless recitations of duty over desire. Then there was the matter of her marriage. Unlike her sisters, who were shipped off to European courts like royal trade goods, Louise married a commoner, or at least a nobleman from within Britain. John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, and later Duke of Argyll, was politically ambitious, sensitive, and reportedly unprepared for the inferno that was being married to Princess Louise. Their union was tense, childless, and subject to endless speculation, some of it deeply personal, much of it quietly circulated among palace staff who were used to gossip being safer than truth. Even her private life became a powder keg. Rumors swirled about alleged affairs, about her friendships with artists, about her disdain for royal expectations. None of it could be confirmed. All of it stuck. To her staff, she was magnetic but exhausting. She kept a tight household, hated inefficiency, and wasn't afraid to dismiss anyone who couldn't meet her standards. Servants either adored her or left quickly. There was no middle ground, and yet Louise endured. She lived well into her 90s, outlasted her critics, continued to work, advocate, and quietly subvert the very system she was born into. She never quite fit the mold, and she never tried to. But for all her rebellion, she still played by some rules. Which is more than can be said for the next royal on our list. Cold, calculating, and a master of financial control, he ruled with suspicion instead of steel. Henry VII, a king with a crown in one hand and a ledger in the other. 26. Henry VII. He wasn't born to be a king. He calculated his way into it. Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, was not the kind of monarch who inspired immediate affection. There were no heroic battlefield speeches, no soaring romance, no great charisma carved into legend. To the public, he was a stabilizer. The king who ended the Wars of the Roses. The one who brought order after decades of dynastic chaos. He rebuilt the kingdom from financial ruin and gave it a dynasty strong enough to survive. Respectable, necessary, endurable. But to those inside his court, especially the nobles and administrators who lived under his gaze, Henry VII was an accountant in a crown, and every interaction with him felt like an audit. He was not beloved. He was tolerated. Carefully. Henry ruled with caution and suspicion. He trusted few and forgave fewer. Even his own supporters walked softly around him. He had learned early, through exile, betrayal, and endless political maneuvering, that power wasn't given, it was hoarded. And once he had it, he guarded it like a miser guards his gold. The public saw a peaceful reign. His courtiers saw a regime of surveillance, paranoia, and financial manipulation. Henry's obsession with fiscal control is legendary. He created what many now consider the early version of the modern bureaucratic state, not out of visionary brilliance, but out of sheer distrust. He established systems of taxation and debt collection that were ruthlessly efficient and alarmingly personal. His most infamous instruments were the counsel learned in the law and his revenue agents, Empson and Dudley, who enforced the king's will with the cheerful subtlety of loan sharks. Nobles were forced to pay bonds, legal promises that could be called in at any moment. Entire families were kept financially shackled to the crown, unsure when the next demand would arrive. Loyalty was measured not just in service, but in solvency. A courtier could be in royal favor one week and bankrupt the next, with little explanation and no appeal. To the staff who managed his court, Henry was equally exacting. He ran a tight household with minimal tolerance for extravagance or spontaneity. Every purchase was documented, every request scrutinized. Where later Tudors would dazzle with pageantry, Henry preferred ledgers to lute players. His treasurers were his most trusted men, and even they feared making a miscalculation. Even his personality seemed built for control. He was reserved in public, bordering on severe, rarely laughed, rarely raised his voice. He didn't command attention like a king. He absorbed it, quietly and completely. Courtiers often remarked on how unreadable he was. His silences could stretch uncomfortably long. His eyes were said to watch more than they spoke. Behind the mask of prudence, though, was an iron will. He made shrewd marriages. His own to Elizabeth of York united two warring houses, and his children's unions expanded his influence across Europe. But even in family life, warmth was scarce. His children were raised with duty first, affection distant. His queen died young. He never remarried. Some said he never quite smiled again. And yet, the country he left behind was stronger than the one he inherited. Not happier, not freer, but richer, more centralized, less volatile. Henry VII wasn't loved, but he didn't need to be. He didn't ask for affection, only obedience. And in his court, affection was a risk few dared show. Unlike the next royal who had more than enough charm to win hearts, at least until he lost his head for strategy and made enemies on every battlefield but the one he thought he'd win. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, cavalier, commander, and court headache in gleaming armor. 27. Prince Rupert of the Rhine. He arrived in England like a warhorse in a library, loud, dazzling, and utterly convinced he was the smartest man in the room. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, nephew to King Charles I, and darling of the royalist cause during the English Civil War, was a swashbuckler in the age of gunpowder. To the public he became a cavalier icon, fearless in battle, impossibly glamorous, and infuriatingly competent. Paintings show him with flowing curls, glinting armor, and a large white poodle named Boy, who, for a brief and ridiculous period, parliamentarians suspected of being a witch. But inside the royalist court, Prince Rupert was often seen not as a heroic savior, but as a royal migraine on horseback. From the beginning, Rupert's pedigree was undeniable. He was born into exile, raised in war, and seasoned in the European theater before setting foot in England. At just 23, he was made commander of the royalist cavalry, partly because of his military credentials, partly because Charles I needed a glamorous figurehead to invigorate his armies. Rupert delivered on both counts. He won early victories and gave the royalists their first real jolt of momentum. Crowds cheered him. Pamphlets praised him. Soldiers followed him without question. But within the command structure, the mood was less celebratory. Rupert's battlefield brilliance came with a towering ego and a notorious refusal to take advice. He believed in cavalry charges, bold maneuvers, and instinctual leadership, all of which worked spectacularly when they succeeded and disastrously when they didn't. He made decisions without consulting senior officers. He insulted those who disagreed. He quarreled with fellow generals, and he developed a reputation for acting first, apologizing never, and retreating only when surrounded. His approach to war was deeply personal. He wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to prove he was right. And in a fractured court filled with cautious aristocrats, whispering clergy, and wary politicians, Rupert's relentless certainty came off as recklessness. Many behind the scenes began to wonder if their most visible commander was more liability than legend. Even King Charles I, who had once doted on his nephew, began to flinch at Rupert's increasingly erratic independence. The prince would sometimes overstep his orders, negotiate behind the king's back, or take drastic action without informing the court. After the disastrous defeat at Marston Moor in 1644, a battle where Rupert's miscalculations played a key role, his shine began to fade. His enemies had a field day. His allies grew cold, and Charles, with characteristic hesitancy, began to distance himself. To make matters worse, Rupert didn't suffer criticism quietly. He lashed out at detractors, blamed others for his losses, and published fiery justifications defending his every move. His command style became more isolated, his inner circle tighter, his temper shorter. Courtiers began to view him as dangerously impulsive, a man who believed that loyalty to the crown meant loyalty to Rupert's version of strategy. After eventually surrendering Bristol to parliamentarian forces, a move the king saw as betrayal, Rupert was briefly dismissed, then reinstated, then exiled. It was a whiplash career made more complicated by his refusal to admit he'd ever made a mistake. And yet, to the public and to loyal royalist soldiers, Rupert remained a symbol of valor, dashing, romantic, larger than life. But in private, among those forced to work with him, he was the storm they couldn't steer and the hero they couldn't quite trust. And that dynamic, public reverence, private resentment, would echo again in the next reign. Because when Prince Rupert faded, another George rose. Not a cavalier, but a king. Not impulsive, but cold. Revered by his nation, yet feared by his own children. George V, the royal wall, and a father no one dared to hug. 28. George V. He looked like a postage stamp come to life. Stern, immaculately dressed, and utterly immovable. George V, grandfather to Queen Elizabeth II and the monarch who guided Britain through World War I and the collapse of empire, was the kind of king who didn't blink when told the world was ending. He simply straightened his tie and ordered more paper. To the public, he was a reassuring figure, a symbol of continuity in a century unraveling at every seam. His face appeared on coins, memorials, and biscuit tins. He shook hands with soldiers, visited bombed-out cities, and stood as a moral anchor during years of chaos. In many ways, George V became the modern monarchy, dignified, distant, duty-bound. But inside the palace gates, his own children knew a different man. They didn't call him Papa. They called him the King. George V was not cruel. He was not unkind. He was simply uninterested in affection. His parenting style made the furniture look warm by comparison. He believed in discipline, hierarchy, and silence at dinner. The emotional needs of his children were secondary to their performance. He once reportedly said of his son Edward, later Edward VIII, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." Which turned out to be accurate, though not exactly supportive. His court functioned with military precision. George had served in the Royal Navy, and he carried that structure into his reign. Meals were timed, conversations limited. No one was late, and no one questioned protocol. Behind his tidy beard and rigid bearing was a man deeply committed to order, because order was safer than intimacy. Palace insiders walked on carefully polished eggshells. George could be deeply loyal to those he trusted, but that trust was hard-won and easily lost. He loathed flattery and sniffed out dishonesty like a bloodhound. If he disliked you, you would know it. If he liked you, he might allow you to speak in his presence without trembling. His children, 5 sons and a daughter, each had their own private struggles with him. The future Edward VIII rebelled with charm and decadence. Albert, the future George VI, developed a debilitating stammer under the pressure of royal expectation. Their letters are filled with formalities and strained attempts to win his approval. None succeeded. He was especially ill-suited to the cultural shifts of the early 20th century. As the world around him began to embrace modernity, flappers, jazz, socialism, George doubled down on tradition. He changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor during World War I to distance the royals from their German roots. It was a savvy move, but also deeply revealing. Image was survival, and survival meant managing every detail. And yet, for all his rigidity, he did preserve the monarchy. He rebranded it from imperial relic to national symbol. He understood that royal power was no longer about control, but about endurance. The people loved him because he never cracked. But his family paid the price for that stability, one cold stare at a time. Behind closed doors, George V was not a monster. He was simply a man who believed the crown came before everything else, even love. Especially love. And speaking of kings who kept their favorites close and everyone else at arm's length, Our next monarch wore glory like armor, handed out rewards with a wink, and let one woman do most of the talking. Edward III, warrior, reformer, and court master of selective affection. 29. Edward III. He was England's warrior king, the architect of medieval glory, and the monarch who made chivalry fashionable again. Edward III reigned for over 50 years, launching the 100 Years' War, reforming military structure, and establishing the Order of the Garter. Because if you're going to make war a lifestyle, you may as well do it in style. To the public, he was a paragon of royal strength. He expanded England's territory, defeated the French at Crécy, and turned his son, the legendary Black Prince, into a medieval celebrity. He was admired, even loved, as a strong hand on the tiller in a century defined by instability. But inside his own court, not everyone was applauding. Because for all his triumphs abroad, Edward III ruled at home with the short attention span of a battlefield general and the loyalty instincts of a schoolboy with a favorite toy. That toy, in this case, was a woman named Alice Perrers, his mistress, his confidant, and for a time, the most powerful unelected figure in the kingdom. Alice Perrers was not born into nobility. She rose through charm, intelligence, and a particular ability to read the king's moods before he even knew he was having them. She became his companion during the decline of his beloved wife, Queen Philippa, and after Philippa's death, Alice became something far more dangerous than a royal distraction. She became Edward's emotional crutch and his political blind spot. The court hated her. Absolutely, seethingly hated her. Not only was Alice a commoner, she was also shamelessly influential. She sat in on meetings. She intervened in court decisions. She was rumored to manipulate appointments, land grants, and legal outcomes. She reportedly wore Queen Philippa's jewelry in public. Even Parliament eventually got involved, passing legislation specifically designed to remove her from power and prohibit women like her from influencing royal policy. But Edward wouldn't let her go. Not even when his advisors begged. Not even when his own sons muttered behind closed doors. His fixation on Alice created a toxic rift in the court, one that never truly healed. Ministers found themselves outmaneuvered. Nobles watched long-standing privileges handed over to a woman they considered a walking scandal in brocade. And all of it happened while Edward, once the model of kingship, slowly declined into something much more fragile. Because that's the part the statues don't show. By the end of his reign, Edward III was no longer the king who charged into battle on horseback. He was sick, confused, increasingly detached from governance. His mind wandered. His judgment wavered. And Alice, sharp-eyed and unapologetically ambitious, filled the vacuum with ruthless efficiency. His children, particularly the more politically aware among them, saw what was happening and quietly plotted for the future. The Black Prince was already dead by then, and young Richard II was being prepped for the throne. The entire court became a game of waiting for Edward to die, waiting for Alice to fall, waiting for a monarchy still wrapped in chainmail to face the modern headaches of inheritance and ambition. And when Edward finally died, no one wept louder than Alice. And no one moved faster to get her out of the palace. He was remembered as a king of strength. But those closest to him knew better. He ruled in bursts of brilliance, and then abandoned the room to whoever could shout loudest, or whisper closest. And the next monarch on our list? She didn't whisper. She didn't plead. She came in like a queen and demanded love, loyalty, and total obedience, only to be left surrounded by fire and silence. Mary Warre, the first queen regnant of England, adored by the faithful, dreaded by the court. 30. Mary I. Early reign. To the English public, at least those who still remembered the turmoil of her father's reign and the dizzying upheaval under her brother, Mary Warre's accession in 1553 felt like a moment of clarity. The rightful daughter of Henry VIII, restored to her place by the will of the people, cheered into London with flowers underfoot and bells in the air. She was their legitimate queen, their Catholic queen, the first woman to rule England in her own name, and for a time, the city bowed for her with genuine relief. But behind the palace walls, in the corridors of court and council, the excitement began to cool within days. Because the Mary who had survived political exile and religious isolation was not the same Mary who was now expected to rule. She was cautious, deeply devout, and utterly uncompromising. She wasn't here to adapt, she was here to restore. And for the people closest to her, advisors, secretaries, ambassadors, ladies-in-waiting, that made her not inspiring, but unpredictable. Mary's early reign was marked by what looked, on the surface, like mercy. She pardoned enemies who had supported Lady Jane Grey's brief claim to the throne. She reassured the Privy Council that she would respect the laws and customs of the land. She spoke in the language of peace and reconciliation. But inside her private chambers, the mood was different. She trusted few, forgave even fewer, and governed as if the crown might be snatched from her at any moment. Perhaps it could have. She'd spent her youth exiled from court, declared illegitimate, cut off from her mother, and forced to watch her father marry and discard queens like political accessories. Her childhood was marked not by privilege, but by humiliation. And now, as queen, she returned every favor and every slight with perfect memory. Mary surrounded herself with loyalists, many of whom had been sidelined under Edward VI. She elevated conservative voices, Spanish sympathizers, and figures with a firm Catholic spine. That in itself wasn't surprising, but the speed and force of her religious reversals shocked even some of her closest supporters. The court expected reform. They got something closer to retribution. Even her marriage to Philip of Spain, a union meant to cement an alliance and secure her succession, alienated her advisors. The match was unpopular, not just with the English public, but with the court itself. Many feared it would turn England into a Spanish satellite. Others simply feared Philip. Cold, foreign, and visibly unenthusiastic about his new wife, he arrived in England like a storm cloud, and the nobility braced themselves for rain. Those tasked with managing Mary's daily affairs soon learned that her piety made compromise nearly impossible. She didn't ask for opinions, she asked for obedience. Her faith wasn't just personal, it was policy. Ministers who suggested moderation in re-establishing Catholicism found themselves ignored, sidelined, or replaced. Those who tried to push back harder didn't last long. Behind the grand processions and formal declarations, Mary's court grew tight-lipped and uneasy. Her temper wasn't theatrical, but it was final. She rarely raised her voice, but when she did, it was with absolute conviction, and it was rarely followed by second chances. Yet the public still saw her through the lens of legitimacy and religious hope. The first woman to wear the crown not as someone's wife or daughter, but in her own right. They called her brave, resilient, holy. But in the inner chambers of Whitehall, her staff had a different word: alone. Because Mary, for all her strength, reigned in isolation, not out of weakness, but out of principle. And nothing isolates a monarch faster than believing they answer to no one but God. And with that, we arrive at the end of this royal parade. Not of crowns, but of contradictions. 30 figures adored by the public and quietly despised behind palace doors. And perhaps that's the final truth of royalty. The closer you get, the colder it feels.